This video is part 2 in my series comparing the central miracles of Islam and Christianity. In part 1, we established something super important, which is that the example of the Prophet Muhammad, his sunnah, which is his life, his teachings, his example in general, that is as central and as important to the Islamic worldview as the Quran. And therefore, if a Muslim is to properly defend the Islamic worldview, he can't just defend the Quran. He must also defend the idea that, he must also defend the prophethood of Muhammad. And so, if you're confused about this, go check out that video. What this means, though, is that the sources that we have telling us about Muhammad, which are the hadith literature primarily, which is hadith means report, a report about Muhammad. The hadith literature then becomes super important to the Islamic worldview, because if you're going to establish that Muhammad was the prophet of God, or that he was who he said he was, then you're going to need to turn to the sources about his life, which is found in the hadith literature. And so that is similar to the New Testament. The New Testament is also a series of reports about Jesus in this case. And, Christians also have a burden of proof to demonstrate that the New Testament is reliable, just like Muslims have to demonstrate that the Hadith literature is reliable. So what we're going to do in this video is I want to show that Muslims actually should trust the New Testament. Because what I'm going to do is take the methodologies that Islamic scholarship has used to assess the reliability and veracity of hadith literature. And I'm going to take those same methodologies and apply them to the New Testament. And we're going to see whether the New Testament stands up to these Islamic methodologies of trying to verify the accuracy of historical reports. So let's dive in. The most common and by far the biggest way that Muslim scholars have traditionally assessed the authenticity of a given hadith is what's known as a chain of narration. So the idea here is that some of the biggest compilers of the hadiths, which are the sayings of Muhammad, were these hadiths were not written down until up to 200 years after Muhammad died. So these are people like Al-Bukhari or Muslim. These are two of the biggest Sunni hadith collectors who compiled a bunch of these oral traditions. Al-Bukhari claims he heard 600,000 different oral traditions, different reports, and they listened to them, and then they wrote down the ones which they had deemed to be the most reliable. And so the problem is that these guys were living, like I said, a couple centuries after Muhammad died. So there's a 2-century gap between the death of Muhammad and the first time these reports en masse start being written down. And so in order to figure out, well, what do we do about that time span? This methodology, it's called Ilm al-Rijal, which is the science of men, developed. And the science of men has to do with assessing the character and the intellect of every single man in a given chain of narration. So what do I mean by a chain of narration? Well, from the time of Muhammad to the time of these compilers of the hadiths, these oral traditions were passed down man to man to man to man. And so we have a list of all the men who were who the story had passed down through for any given tradition. So any given hadith that's worth its weight, that's worth its salt, is going to have a list of the people who narrated this. So here's an example. Here's a real life example from one of the hadiths collected by Sahih al-Bukhari. So it says, so Bukhari, the guy who wrote this down, he says, I heard it from Abdullah ibn Yusuf, who heard it from Malik ibn Anas, who heard it from Muhammad ibn Ubaid Allah al-Zuhri, who heard it from Humayd ibn Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who heard it from Abu Huraira, who heard it from the Prophet, peace be upon him, who said, ... So you see here, we've got a number of men here. We've got Abdullah ibn Yusuf, Malik ibn Anas, Muhammad ibn Ubaidullah, etc., etc., etc. And so, Ilm al-Rijal, the science of men, sought to look at each of these men and say, do we know who this guy was? Do we know what his character was? And do we know whether he was smart? Because again, these are all orally passed down. So we have no way of actually assessing the content of this oral tradition to see if it changed at all during this time period. All we can do is assess the character of the men involved, and if we can trust the men, then the thinking goes, then we can trust the traditions they pass down. And so uh, there's a, this is a whole can of worms that I'm not going to get into in terms of assessing which are the most reliable and which are the less reliable. Generally speaking, the most reliable, the most authentic hadiths, known as sahih hadiths, um, are those which every single man in that tradition was extremely intelligent and was known to be very honest and was also we know enough about his life to know that he had an opportunity to hear the story from the guy he claimed to hear from and to pass on the story to the guy he claimed to pass it on to. And so those are the three main criteria. And if those three are met, then then the hadith is considered to be authentic. If everything is good, but one of the guys in the chain was known to be a good man, but he had a faulty memory at times, then it gets downgraded to, we'll call it reliable. Hasan is the word, like good. And so, and then beyond that, then there's da'if, which is weak, and then under that we have like mawdu, which is like fabricated. And so there's these gradings, and it's really hard to know exactly the numbers of like how many of these hadith were authentic versus good versus weak. The numbers range very wildly between scholars, and my point is not to get into the numbers here or to figure out that. My point is just to look at the methodology that's being used. So the methodology here is, again, we don't need to look at the content of the material that was passed down. We don't need to look at what these people said, because we can't look at it. It's all oral. All we have to do to be able to trust a saying is to identify the people that were involved in passing it down and to ascertain that these people were reliable. Now, of course, you might be wondering who says who's reliable. Well, that's going to come from within the Islamic community. And so Muslim scholars are okay with using what we would call biased sources to ascertain the veracity and the reliability of every single person in a given chain of narration. So, basically, this is the first methodology, which is isnad chain of narration. So even though one of these men could lie, right? That's of course a possibility, or could fabricate the hadith at some point, or change the hadith at some point along the line. Even though that's a possibility, Muslims are willing to kind of take the leap of faith and say, if they're well known and they're known to be a reliable person and have a good memory, then we're happy to trust this as a reliable source. And even though it doesn't touch the text, it's okay. So bear this in mind. This is the standard, this is the methodology that the Muslim scholars use and still have used for a millennium, sorry. And so that's the first methodology. And the second methodology, well, before we get there, actually, I just wanted to mention briefly, I can't go without saying this, but there are some problems with this methodology. I'm not going to get into them too much, but basically all it is, I'll mention, is that even Muslim scholars like people like Shabir Ali or Yasir Qadi, who work in secular scholarship, they recognize that this methodology does not really hold up to secular scholarship and to modern scrutiny, modern standards, because it doesn't touch the text. You can't analyze the text. The fact that I might be a reliable person does not mean that everything I say is true. And so that's a jump of faith that modern scholars aren't willing to take. So anyway, there's lots of people who talk about this and debate this. My point is, we'll just, for the sake of argument, we're going to accept this. We're going to accept that this methodology works and that the hadith literature stands up to the scrutiny. Okay, for the sake of this argument, so Muslims, we're good. I'm going to just say we're going to accept it. We're going to accept everything you're claiming about this. We're going to say isnad chain methodology works. Great. Moving on to the next methodology. The second methodology is tawatur, which is like mass transmission. And so this is, the idea here is that in some cases, there were multiple people who heard Muhammad say something. And each of those people had their own chains of narration, that each of these guys told a friend of theirs who told a friend of theirs who told a friend of theirs, etc., for 2 centuries, and then it came to Bukhari or whoever was compiling it, and they wrote it down. Now, tawatur is really good, and actually this is a methodology that modern scholars do recognize as valid, because it's falsifiable. Because if you have 2 independent chains of narration that the people in those chains of narration didn't, communicate with each other, or as far as we can tell, didn't communicate with each other, and at the end the content is the same, then that's a really strong piece of evidence that this is a reliable saying. And so Again, like with chains of narration, we also have different grades for how good a given hadith scores. So the highest grade is mutawatir, which is like mass transmitted. Unfortunately, it looks like almost none of the hadiths actually stand up to that quality, stand up to that standard. Maybe one or two. Again, depends on the scholar. The next one under that is well known, which was passed down to a number of people, but that's also a small percent. Maybe 10% of hadiths count as that. And then we have under that we have Aziz, which is like just two different chains, and then we have Ahad, which is just one narration chain. Now, again, for the sake of argument, we're going to accept this methodology that if you can verify that there were multiple independent chains of narration that led to the same outcome, that led to the same saying being confirmed, then that's also meaning that that saying is trustworthy. Again, I don't want to get into this, but unfortunately for hadith sciences, the vast majority of hadith are ahad, are only singularly attested, are not multiply attested, somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 90%, depending on who you talk to, who you ask. But the majority, the overall majority, are not multiply attested. But we're not going to go there right now. For the sake of argument, I'm going to accept that that is a valid methodology and that the hadith literature stands up to that. It's okay with that. That methodology confirms the hadith literature. Okay, so we have these two different methodologies for assessing hadiths. We have ilm al-rijal, which is like assessing the character of all the men in a given chain of narration. If they're all good, then we can trust what comes from that chain of narration. The second one is tawatur, which is if there are multiple chains of narration that are independent and they all come out with the same answer, the same saying, then we can trust that. Okay, great. So how does this apply to the New Testament now? Now remember, the point of this whole exercise that we're doing is to see if we can trust each other's sources, because I'm going to try to defend the resurrection and a Muslim is going to try to defend the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad. And the Muslim needs the hadith literature in order to do that, because the hadith literature is the main source for the life of Muhammad. And I need the New Testament to do that, because the New Testament is the main source about the life of Jesus. Here's the thing. I am not going to defend the entire New Testament. All I'm going to be doing is a minimalist approach, which is all I'm going to say is all that needs to be true for the resurrection of Jesus to be reliable or to be known to be reliable is that the stories, some might say the hadiths, about the resurrection and death of Jesus, those need to be reliable. If those are reliable, then I can still defend the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, even if other components or elements of the New Testament are unreliable. And of course, Muslims would accept this, right? Just because one hadith is unreliable or weak or forged, as they admit many hadiths are weak, many hadiths have been forged, that doesn't impugn the good character of the well-established hadiths, right? You can't say, well, this hadith over there, is forged, therefore all hadiths are forged. No, that's not how that works. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. And the New Testament, though it's a book now, that was not how it was formed. The New Testament was formed as oral sayings that were compiled by people like Mark and other writers, and those compilations were then made into what we see as a book. But it's the same process that the hadith literature underwent, right? It was an oral process that became a written process. Now the written process began much earlier. It wasn't a 200-year gap, but even still, originally these were sayings that were passed down orally and then eventually written down. So what I'm going to be doing is defending the hadith literature, the hadiths, the reports about the resurrection and the death of Jesus. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So let's begin. The first methodology is the chain of narration. Do we have a solid chain of narration for the resurrection and the death of Jesus? Do we have that? Well, Muslim apologists will often say the Gospels are anonymous. We don't know anything about them. These are just random people. These could be anybody. And in the mind of a Muslim apologist, I can see why this would be a problem, because they're used to this methodology of chain of narration where you're establishing, you need to know who's in the chain of narration. If you don't know who they are, then you don't know how reliable they were in passing down their narration. And a lot of Christians will kind of missed the point here on this. Actually, this is not true. The core ideas, the core elements, the core stories in the New Testament absolutely have chains of narration. That is to say, we know the people who were involved in every step of the narration until it was written down. So, for example, I'll give you three narration chains that we have. We have Jesus, who taught his disciple John, who then taught his disciple Polycarp, a very well-known early Christian figure, who then taught his disciple St. Irenaeus, who's also a huge figure in the 2nd century, who then wrote down a lot of the information that he heard. And so the same thing like we have with the earlier hadiths, with the hadiths from Islam, we have the same thing here. We have every one of these men, Jesus, John, Polycarp, Irenaeus, we have great information about. I would venture to say we have more information about them than Muslims have for many of the people in their isnad chains that they trust. Second isnad chain. Jesus taught Peter, his disciple. Peter taught Clement of Rome, and Clement of Rome wrote down what Peter taught him. So again, we know all these men. We know very much about them. We have a huge amount of information about them. So that's great. Third isnad chain, third chain of narration. We have Jesus, who taught the Apostle John, who then also taught Ignatius of Antioch. Okay, same thing. We know all these people in the chain of narration. Great, that's good. Now, you may be wondering, well, what exactly are the things that Jesus taught John, who taught Polycarp, who taught Irenaeus, etc.? Well, what those are going to include are the death and resurrection of Jesus is in all of them, as well as the core teachings of Jesus, his parables, his claims to divinity. But basically all the core elements of the New Testament are the stories that were passed down through these men. And of course, the death and resurrection of Jesus is in all of them. That is the fundamental core teaching of Christianity. And so even if you want to dispute some of the more tangential issues that were passed down, whether those are reliable or not, that's okay. My only goal is to show that the stories, the hadith around the death and resurrection of Jesus have been reliably passed down, and we can say that they have strong chains of narration. So there we go. Right off the bat, we have the first Islamic methodology passes, the New Testament passes. We have narration chains of people that we know, and we know all these people were intelligent, extremely reliable, and they all had opportunity to meet each other because they all, we know so much about their lives. We know exactly where they were at what times, and we know that they were interacting with each other. We also have third-party witnesses where other people would write about, for example, Polycarp being the disciple of John. That's not just him saying that, that's other people confirming that, etc. So these are very strong chains of narration. So again, if you're a Muslim now and you look at that, I think you are bound to accept the information that was passed down through that methodology. If you don't accept that, then I have to ask, are you just doing special pleading? Are you just saying, well, that methodology works for my worldview, but if someone else uses that methodology, that's not valid? I think that's silly. Obviously, you have to accept a methodology as either sound or unsound, and this methodology, when applied to the New Testament, absolutely verifies the truth of the core teachings of the New Testament. So now the second methodology, the first one was narration chain methodology. The second one is mass transmission or tawatur methodology. So were the core elements of Jesus' life and teachings, were these mass transmitted? Was there only one chain of narration? Well, as it turns out, no. Basically every single core element of Jesus' life and teachings was not mass transmitted in the sense of like having 10 or more independent chains, but definitely all had multiple independent chains of narration. We're talking anywhere between 2 and 5, depending on how you count them. And so these are not individual chains of narration. So these are I'm just going to list the key elements of Jesus' life, not exhaustively. There's much more than this, but these are some of the key elements of Jesus' life that we have multiple independent chains of narration for. So we have the crucifixion, the resurrection, Jesus' teachings on divorce, Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God, Jesus cleansing the temple, Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies, his triumphal entry to Jerusalem, him predicting his death, many of his parables, his healing miracles, the Last Supper, his teachings on the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and his divine actions like walking on water, healing people, and his Son of Man statements. So, I mean, even if just these are true and the rest of the New Testament were false, that would prove Christianity to be true. That's all you need for Christianity to be true, and incidentally for Islam to be false. And so these all pass the test of tawatur. Again, like I said, the vast majority of hadiths that Muslims rely on, I'm not talking about Muslims, hadiths that Muslims throw away, but the vast majority of hadiths that Muslims rely on for their praxis, for their judgments, for their daily religious life, they are not multiply independently attested. The vast majority of them are only singularly attested. There's only one chain of narration. Whereas for the key elements of the New Testament, we have multiple chains of narration. So, if a Muslim looks at this and says, I don't trust the New Testament, I don't trust that the resurrection happened, I can't believe that, I'm going to have to ask them, do you take your own scholars' methodologies seriously? Because if you do, then you're kind of left with one of two options. Either you accept the New Testament's teachings on the death and resurrection of Jesus as reliable. You just bite that bullet and say, okay, you know what? We're going to consider those teachings to be reliable, even if we don't think the whole New Testament is reliable, even if we think parts of it have been corrupted. At least this core about Jesus' death and resurrection and some of his core teachings, that has been preserved and passed down faithfully. So you could say that, or you could just throw everything out and say, well, we don't know anything about Jesus, and we also don't know anything about Muhammad. But guess what? If you say that, then I don't see how you can be a Muslim. Then you're just basically saying, I can't know anything about my own religion. Then why are you a Muslim? On what basis can you even justify your own belief? So this is a really important discussion to have here, because I think that what happens is that people get caught up in trying to prove the whole New Testament or trying to prove the whole of the Hadith literature. And you can't do that. You have to take the specific claims and take them on a case-by-case basis. So when you do that, when you look at the reports in the New Testament about the death and resurrection of Jesus and his core teachings, you see that they are multiply attested and they have a solid chain of narration. And so therefore, according to Islamic standards, they should be considered to be reliable. So where does this leave us? Well, where this leaves us is I propose a truce with Muslims on this front. For the sake of argument, I'm happy to accept the Hadith literature as reliable. You know, that which passes through the tests of sanad and tawatur, which of course is what you do as well. I will accept those hadiths if you also accept the reports from the New Testament that also pass through the standards of tawatur and sanad. And so if you will do that, I will do that. And if we do that, then I think we will be able to have a fruitful dialogue on which of these two miracles, the resurrection of Jesus or the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad, which of these two miracles is more likely to be true. And so in the next video, what we're going to be doing is dealing with that question of talking about, okay, now that we can trust the New Testament on this topic and we can trust the Hadith literature on this topic, what do we do now? How do we assess these miracles? We're going to begin to actually dive into the miracle claim of the Muslims and the miracle claim of the Christians, and to see which of these two miracles makes more sense. So I hope this has been interesting. I'm sorry if it feels that I have simplified or oversimplified these things. I understand that ilm al-rijal, ilm hadith, all these things are really complicated and deep topics that I'm not an expert in. But I think I've done a fair job of representing these methodologies, and like I said, I'm not even attacking them in this video. I'm going to accept them for the sake of argument. So I hope you found this video interesting. If so, leave a comment, let me know what you think, and I pray that the Lord blesses you and your family greatly. Thanks for watching.